The box. You opened it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no. It is a means to summon us.
Who are you?
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some. Angels to others.
It was a mistake! I didn't mean to open it! It was a mistake! You can... Go to hell!
We can't. Not alone. You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasures.
Please, go away and leave me alone.
Oh, no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering.
That might be one of my favourite scenes from any horror film. Not only does Ashley Lawrence do a good job of conveying the terror of coming face to face with the Cenobites, but it also properly introduces us to Pinhead, and so begins one of the most infamous horror franchises to date. Hellraiser is a 1987 horror film written and directed by Clive Barker, based off one of the writer's earlier novellas, The Hellbound Heart. While this might be Barker's most well-known directorial work, it was not the first film he was involved with, writing scripts for Rawhead Rex, a film also based off one of his novellas, and Underworld, which is sometimes known as Transmutations. Both of these films are interesting examples of his work and something I might cover in another video, but they weren't directed by Barker. What's more interesting to me are his experimental early films, Salome and The Forbidden, and the impact those two films had in creating Hellraiser. However, before we get into them, let's have a little look at Barker himself. Barker was born on October 5th, 1952 in Liverpool, where he would spend his young life. While at school he became involved with theatre, after which he would write and collaborate on several plays before going on to found a theatrical troupe in 1978 called The Dog Company. From there he began writing his short story collections, The Books of Blood, which were published in 1984 and became what he was best known for. From this point on, he then had a multitude of successful novels including The Damnation Game, Weave World and Imagica, as well as many others I'm not going to list here because I would genuinely be here all day. It didn't really seem like he slept. With his books, short stories, plays, video games and films, I cannot understand how he had the time for all of it. Here are some screenshots from Wikipedia of all of his stuff, and as you can see, he definitely kept himself busy. I personally am a big fan of The Books of Blood. If you take nothing else away from this video, if you enjoy sometimes violent, sometimes creepy, but pretty much always disturbing short horror stories, then go give them a look. It was one of those short stories that was adapted into the 1992 film Candyman, which was remade this year and I think has done reasonably well, so clearly they're still holding up and managing to find an audience. To cut a very long story short, he also managed to find time to direct Hellraiser after he was supposedly dissatisfied with how other people had handled his work. That was successful, and now he mainly writes and is producing while living in LA. That is a massive oversimplification of this man's very interesting life, but we're here to talk about his early films. I'm already running over time that I had allotted for this, and we're not even on the first one yet. So, to save this from being 3 hours long, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. And by skip ahead, I mean go all the way back in time to 1973. Here, an 18-year-old Barker was going around Liverpool cinemas watching a variety of art house and mainstream films. Seeing these made him want to give it a go himself, and after witnessing the success of films like Empire, the Andy Warhol one where they pointed a still camera at the Empire State Building for about 8 hours, it seemed as if the required level of skill to operate a camera might not actually be that high. So he and his friends used an 8mm camera in the basement of a flower shop to film Salome. The theatrical troupe he was a part of at the time had already been performing a stage version of the story, and so the film was to be an adaptation of that. Something to bear in mind was that one of the actors used in Barker's play was Doug Bradley, who would later best be known for playing a certain sadomasochistic Cenobite with nails hammered into his skull. But what is Salome? Well, it has been many things, including a play by Oscar Wilde, an opera, and a story that's been adapted into various films. However, its source can be traced back to the Bible, so spoilers ahead for the Bible in case you haven't had a chance to read that yet in the 2,000 years or so it's been around. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, it is described how Herod Antipas had John the Baptist imprisoned for speaking out against his marriage to Herodias, who had previously been married to his half-brother, Herod Philip, which is just an awesome way to keep it in the family. Good job here, guys. Herod Antipas was then throwing a festival in which he convinced Salome to dance for him and his guests on the promise that she could have anything she wanted. Okay, so Salome is the daughter of Herodias, who Herod Antipas is now married to, meaning that this king basically just got a lap dance off of his stepdaughter, which I do not know how I feel about that at all. In any case, her mother, Herodias, who was angry at John the Baptist because he spoke out against her quasi-ancestral marriage, convinces Salome to ask for the prophet to be beheaded. Salome asks for this, Herod doesn't want to lose face, so he agrees, and John the Baptist's head is brought to Salome. We don't really know from the Bible what ultimately happened to Salome, although some records state she eventually drowned in a river, mimicking the dance she performed for Herod as she went under the water. That's the original story, but Barker's Salome is based off Wilde's play, which differs slightly, because as if this story couldn't get any weirder. In this version, Salome is at Herod's birthday party. She sees the imprisoned John the Baptist and falls in love, vowing that she will kiss him on the lips after getting him temporarily released from his prison cell. So far, so very teenage rom-com. John the Baptist basically calls her a whore, which is slightly less teenage rom-com, and then returns to his prison cell, becoming the patron saint of all people who stand against simps in the process. Salome then hatches a little plan, though. When Herod asks her to dance and the promise for anything she wants, she asks for John the Baptist's head on a silver platter. She dances, John is beheaded, and the severed head is brought to her, at which point she kisses it, fulfilling her vow that she would kiss his lips. Herod is then like, what the fuck, you just kissed his severed head, ew. Salome is like, well, you know, I vowed to do it and now I've done it, so I've made my point. And Herod's like, okay, I guess that's still super weird though, and we can't really be having that, so you're also going to be executed. He then ordered his soldiers to crush her under their shields, and that's the end of the play. So, quick summary of that version of the story. A slightly ancestral family decides that necrophilia is a step too far. That's the 100% true and accurate takeaway from this specific piece of art. Feel free to quote me in your essays. Now, on to Barker's Salome. Everything I described to you just now, I found out by researching afterwards. I went into Barker's Salome completely blind to the story to see what I could make of it, and truth be told, I came out a little confused. Going back and rewatching it after knowing the story, I can see how it all fits together and how the story works in this film, but there's also a lot of symbolism and imagery that doesn't necessarily make the film completely clear in a narrative sense. However, despite that, this film really isn't without its merits. First of all, this was made by a bunch of 18-year-olds who had never been to film school, had no budget, and were filming this in the cellar of a flower shop in the evenings and at the weekends. I think I remember reading that they only had one light to light the whole thing with, and it should also be noted that this was the 70s. There wasn't any digitisation back then. All of this stuff was done on actual 8mm film, adding another layer of complexity to everything. You know, once you're out of that stuff, you can't film anymore without buying a new reel. You can't watch playbacks. The fact that they even attempted something like this out of pure passion for the story and the medium should be commended in and of itself. On top of that, while the narrative might be confusing to someone who doesn't know the story, the film does an amazing job at setting an atmosphere. I'll play a few clips here, but I think you definitely get the sense of the tones that they were going for in the different segments of the film, even without necessarily knowing what the story is behind it. As you can see, in that montage were the key moments of the story. Salome dancing, her kissing the decapitated head, Herod getting angry at her, and then being crushed at the very end by a shield. Or what I think is a door being used as a shield, which is really grassroots filming at its finest. For this next little analysis, we are fully moving away from the source-based stuff I got from interviews and articles to my interpretation of the film. So be aware, I may be completely off the mark, but if you think I am, let me know in the comments. Ultimately, this type of film is more towards the indie/art house end of the filmic scale, and this kind of stuff is a bit like Marmite, as in, you either love it or you hate it. Either way, there are definitely some bits everybody should be able to appreciate. The first thing to take note of is the setting. Throughout, the limited space they had is utilised in a variety of different ways to make it seem like anything from a corridor, a prison cell, to an endless dreamlike expanse of black. That last picture being taken from what I assume is a dream fantasy of Salomé's, where her and John the Baptist do the deed. This is incredibly impressive considering it was all just shot in one basement location and something that, any kind of amateur filmmaker can definitely learn from. One of the interesting things they did with the set is that it looks like they have painted a mural of Herod's watching face on the wall during the dancing sequence, rather than using the actor playing him. I guess their reasons for doing that are up for debate, but this kind of demonstrates the point I made earlier, where certain artistic choices can make the story hard to follow if you're not necessarily familiar with it. We'll put a pin in that, because that's something I'll be coming back to in just a second. The choice of shots combined with the lighting and the sound design are where this film really shines though. The ominous feeling you get when Salome is first entering the building, to how when she's dancing it almost feels otherworldly. I'm always impressed by films that still manage to evoke an atmosphere or tone even when you don't know what the fuck is going on. A regular feeling of mine when I watch most Christopher Nolan films. All the music was apparently done by a guy called Adrian Carson, and he has just done an excellent job with this. Given the whole thing doesn't contain any dialogue, the actors all do a really good job of conveying what they're feeling through their emotional expression and their movements. I particularly like how Salome goes from this almost cheeky, scheming young woman to someone who looks almost as if they're in a trance, so shocked by what they've done at the end as the execution is announced. So, there are a bunch of things I respect and like about the film. But I do also think there are some aspects that don't necessarily work as well, or are just downright confusing. One scene I've not mentioned so far is of the naked woman standing in the darkness with a torch as a naked man descends down a ladder and faces the camera with a sword on display, as well as his penis. Obviously, I'm not going to show that on YouTube, but based on where it is in the film and the fact the guy's got a sword, I think it's showing them going down into the dungeon to prepare to execute John the Baptist. However, why the naked lady? Why the naked man, given everyone has been dressed up until now? Again, it's just the stuff like that that kind of throws you and makes it really hard to follow. The only other bit I had a real problem with was what I assume is John's execution. I think the clip I showed earlier of the man doing the movement with the sword is supposed to signify the decapitation. This is a very arty way to do it, and importantly, although it shows movement with a sword, it doesn't really hint at any kind of specific head removal. Obviously there wasn't a budget, and so you're somewhat limited in the ways that you can show a head being cut off, but it does mean that when I watched this for the first time, before I read up on the story, I was at a loss as to what the fuck was actually happening at the end when she was just kissing this bloody man's face. I should also say, there isn't anything wrong with films like Salome that, have a narrative that's a bit difficult to follow. Many art house films are more concerned with evoking feelings and emotions rather than telling a story. The only reason I'm looking at this and then later at The Forbidden in a narrative sense at all, and not purely as pieces of art designed to make you feel, is because they're both based off pre-existing stories, so it kind of invites that comparison rather than purely being a display of emotions. Overall then, Salome is an interesting art house first film, which you're probably only going to be able to follow properly if you already know what the story is about. However, despite that, if you watch it going in blind like I did, you can definitely still appreciate the moods and atmospheres it creates, which, to be honest, I think is probably more the intended purpose anyway. We'll return to this point at the very end of the video with a little clip of Clive Barker talking about this himself. Probably the biggest takeaway from the film is just how Clive Barker it is, and how it deals with a lot of the themes he revisits in his work again and again and again. Desire, sexuality, bargaining, violence. Do these themes perhaps ring especially true with a certain film that is the namesake of this video? Perhaps? Maybe? No? The thematic basis of Hellraiser can definitely be seen here, but arguably, it can also be seen in about 90% of Clive Barker's work. Nevertheless, Salome is a good basis, and if, at least when it comes to film, it helped to cement Barker's themes, The Forbidden takes it a step further, and we start to see actual physical concepts begin to take place that we definitely see again in Hellraiser. Filmmakers bring what they've learnt from whatever role they might have had on previous sets to new productions they are planning or working on. Perhaps the most famous example of this is James Cameron and how he utilised many different aspects of Galaxy of Terror when he was shooting Aliens. That's a whole story in and of itself, but definitely one to check out if you like sci-fi and cool Hollywood stories. For Clive Barker, his time spent shooting The Forbidden clearly bore a direct correlation to how he went designing Hellraiser. We'll look at the specifics of that in a second, but first, let's have a look at what The Forbidden is. Barker describes the 1978 film as a re-envisioning of the Faustian myth. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what this is, the tale of Faust was originally a German legend in which a successful scholar, dissatisfied with his life, makes a deal with the devil for infinite knowledge and lots of earthly pleasures. If those of you watching can see where I'm going with this, congrats, you've pretty much sussed out the remainder of the video. In The Forbidden, we see a man, the Faust character, who is played by Peter Aitkins, the guy who wrote Hellraiser 2 and 3, as well as playing the barman in the third, complete some kind of occult ritual, piece together a ripped-up tapestry of runes, and eventually pay the price for what he's done. I'll save exactly what happens to him until the end, but first, here's a highlight reel to take you through some of the key moments and give you a feel for the film overall. Let me take you through that step by step. We start off seeing some kind of ritual, creating this big sheet of runes on the wall. Looks like our Faustian character who has made this is trying to understand it. Getting frustrated, he tears it up and then looks at trying to rearrange and put it back together. Looks like something might be happening as we get this ominous movement of light along with a tapestry of runes well, it's now really a puzzle being reconstructed. It's then confirmed it worked with the appearance of our devil character. The devil-type person takes off his mask and then proceeds to start choking our Faust. But we then see our Faust having a sexual fantasy. There was an actual sex scene, and not just him making out with a table, but I won't show that because, again, YouTube. After this, more of the puzzle is put back in place. We then see the runes being marked on our Faust's skin before the puzzle looks as if it is now basically complete. We then meet the twitchy man who does a penis dance while our Faust watches. We will come back to this. We will definitely be coming back to this. Then, though, comes the ending. I wanted to pause before showing this to you because it's super interesting seeing the direction the story goes in. Traditionally, the Faustian legend has two different endings depending on the version you read. In one, Faust begs forgiveness from God, who does forgive him and saves him from the devil at the cost of eternal famine. Not great, but it could be worse. Worse, in fact, like the other ending, where Faust reaches the end of the deal and is irreversibly corrupted, so is dragged to hell by the devil. Knowing this, knowing what we know about Clive Barker, and knowing what themes he likes to explore, what do you think happens to our Faust in The Forbidden? If you guessed that our Faust is skinned alive before entering a kind of paradise, you are correct. I'm going to play some clips from this section. In the film it's about 10 minutes long and I've cut it down a bit, but it genuinely has some fairly horrifying moments. Once that's all done, we will then just talk about all of this film before moving on to some other stuff. We'll get onto the direct comparison to Hellraiser in a sec, as well as some notes on that final scene. But first and foremost, purely as a standalone film, I prefer The Forbidden to Salome. For starters, The Forbidden was much easier to follow. You don't need outside information about Faustian-style stories to be able to understand it, although it definitely helps when trying to make sense of some things, rather than just seeing how each scene leads into the other. Again, echoing what I said earlier, nothing wrong with a film that just wants to make you feel and experience things, but personally, I find that when it's too confusing, that confusion takes me away from what I'm supposed to be experiencing. If any film buffs are watching this, I guess you can consider that a hot take, but that's why I prefer The Forbidden to Salome. I think the choice to do it all in black and white negative was very noteworthy. For those who don't know, negative is a way that you can develop film, in this case making all the things that would appear darker lighter and the lighter parts darker if it were to be developed normally. Now, was this due to artistic choice or the increased expense of trying to film in colour? To be honest, I think it's probably a mixture of the two. I say this because in one of the interviews I watched, they said that colour was expensive to produce in, but negative being slightly cheaper. Negative also makes the part when our Faust moves his hand over the scroll to look almost supernatural, with the light being cast on the page instead of a shadow. I have no idea if this was intentional or not, but we'll go with it. As for the skinning section, I think the fact it's a negative really adds to the horror. I find it incredibly disturbing how the lighter colours are replaced by the darker ones as the skin is slowly removed. It gives a real sense of change and the painstaking procedure that our Faust is going through. This scene was achieved using practical effects and body paint, and if we saw it in colour along with the greater details that come along with that, I don't know if it would have been as convincing as it is in negative, where the simplified tones allow the viewer to almost fill in the horrific blanks for themselves. Speaking of that final section, I also think the direction given by Barker and Aikins' performance add to the horror. There is one specific bit where we see his eyes move as the skin is peeled off his face that makes it hit home that he is fully aware of everything going on and yet almost seems to choose to let it happen. And the idea of that just freaks me out. On top of that, the sound and music design is again great. It was done by Adrian Carson, and I think it's a shame he hasn't done any films since then, as he does such a good job helping to create the atmospheres in both of these movies. However, there are still some moments in this film that to me scream art house pretensions, and I just don't know how much they actually bring to the movie as a whole. These include moments like the random man with face paint on at the beginning, the animated flying birds, the close-ups of insects. I just don't really see what they add to anything. I can overlook all of them though, as they don't really get in the way of anything else, and they clearly have meaning that I'm just not willing to necessarily look as far as they want me to in order to find it. There is one bit though that I cannot just look over, and this was the 6-minute long section of The Dancing Penis Man. A section which is quite possibly the first example of someone performing the helicopter dick manoeuvre on camera. 6 minutes is a long time in filmmaking terms, and how can I put this? The dancer remains excited throughout. I'm struggling to find the point of this section, in all honesty. If somebody knows, please dear God tell me. We see the Faust character being strangled and then getting some, so we understand that the bargain he's made contains both pleasurable things and less pleasurable things, although not necessarily in that order. So I don't know if this dance is supposed to highlight more of the otherworldly pleasures we can expect to experience when making a deal with the devil. To be honest, if a 6-minute helicopter dicking is all I can expect in exchange for my immortal soul, I think I'll probably give it a miss. I think that's enough about The Forbidden specifically. Overall, it's an interesting film with cool and effective low-budget practical effects which are used to, if slightly ambiguously at times, tell an interesting story. Yet again, we have these same themes of bargaining, lust at violence and desire that are common to both Salome and The Forbidden, along with practical effects and a slightly more significant shift towards a narrative story in the latter film. For the last part of this video then, let's have a look at how all of this played a role in Hellraiser. Hellraiser then. I'm going to assume if you've clicked on this video, then you're probably already familiar with the film. If you're not, pause this and go watch it because it's an amazing horror cult classic. To summarise though, for the sake of everyone's memory, a freaky guy called Frank obtains an ornate puzzle box, the Lament configuration, and upon solving it, he is torn apart by a chain seemingly coming from the darkness. Frank's brother Larry and his wife Julia, who Frank had an affair with, move into the house where Frank used the box. Larry accidentally cuts himself with the blood from the cut, inadvertently starting to reform the dead Frank. Julia finds the skinless Frank and starts bringing back men and murdering them so Frank can regain more of his body and the pair can run away together and presumably live a messed up kind of happily ever after. Kirsty, Larry's daughter, sees Julia bringing a man back to the house for Frank. Kirsty thinks Julia is having another affair, so goes in to investigate and accidentally discovers Frank feeding. In order to escape, Julia picks up the puzzle box off the floor, throws it through the window and jumps out. She then runs off with the box before collapsing and waking up in hospital. While there, she solves it and summons the Cenobites, including Pinhead, and makes a deal where she'll lead them to Frank if they spare her life. The Cenobites agree, Kirsty goes back to the house, finds Frank has killed her dad and is wearing her skin to try and trick her. Frank then accidentally stabs Julia but doesn't really care. Frank then confesses to murdering Larry. Hearing this, the Cenobites appear and tear him apart. Kirsty is like, okay, so now you're going to leave me alone, right? The Cenobites are like, nah, we tricked you, lol. So Kirsty then solves the box, forcing them back to hell. Alright, well, if you didn't know Hellraiser, you now do. Won't go into all its pros and cons now, as this video is looking to be long enough as it is. Instead, let's have a look at the key features of The Forbidden and Hellraiser and see exactly how similar they are. both have their ritualistic starting point. In The Forbidden, it was the creation of the tapestry of all the hieroglyphics or runes, and in Hellraiser we have the puzzle box that needs to be solved. Super interesting is the idea that they both need to be solved, with the box needing to be unlocked for a complex number of movements, and the destroyed tapestry needed to be pieced back together for something to happen. At the very end of both films, it's clear that each of these need to be resolved again for the process to start anew. Next up is the devil figure. In The Forbidden, we have what we can assume is the devil, whom our Faust character makes some kind of bargain with, or he enters into an agreement with by summoning him with the runes. Hellraiser is the exact same. Instead of the runes, it's the puzzle box, and instead of the devil, we have Pinhead and his troupe of Cenobites. Following on from this, what the summoners both get, their bargain, is basically the same thing as well. In The Forbidden, our Faust experiences pain through the strangling, but is also given visions of ecstasy, and whatever the helicopter penis dance thing is. In Hellraiser, the sadomasochistic Cenobites work off a very similar principle. Through experiencing pain the way they have, pain and pleasure become somewhat indistinguishable. Like our Faust in The Forbidden, they too both suffer and experience pleasure almost simultaneously, and this is what they enact on those who solve the box. Like exactly what happens to Frank at the beginning of the film. Speaking of Frank, and the fact that he appears completely skinless to start off with in this film, there is also clearly a parallel there, at least visually. Thematically, Frank starts off skinned, wanting to regain his human form, while our Faust ends up becoming skinned, entering a sort of paradise, and I guess is happy? As happy as you can be. Although somewhat different, it's clearly the same idea being played around with, just to different ends. The theme of lust also plays a big part in both. Clearly this was something our Faust desired, and it's also Julia's whole driving force for killing and wanting Frank to be whole again. I think I've probably saved the most interesting one for last. The nail board used in The Forbidden to create the lighting effect evolves in several ways before being used in Hellraiser. The first is this shot where we see how the beams of light move through the wall, which looks like the same effect as the nail board, just on a bigger budget. They also both symbolise the summoning of their respective demon. In The Forbidden, it's the devil, and in Hellraiser, it's Pinhead and the Cenobites. The second is how those nails were actually used to inspire the design of Pinhead himself. Now, it might sound like I'm completely clutching at straws here, but here are the words from the Cenobite himself.
One image I remember very strongly from The Forbidden was that Clive had built what he called his nail board, which was basically a block of wood which he'd squared off, and then he'd banged 6-inch nails in at the intersections of the squares, and spent endless hours playing with what happened if a light was swung around in front of it to see the way that the shadows of the nails moved, and what happened if it was toplit, and so forth. Of course, when I saw the first illustrations for this gentleman, it rang a bell with me that here was actually Clive putting the ideas that he'd been playing around with the nail board in The Forbidden. Now, 10, 15 years later or whatever, here he'd actually put the image all over a human being's face, which is typical of the way that he will work with ideas. You'll find little bits of ideas that he would play around with that 10, 15 years later, when apparently it's all forgotten with, that idea is suddenly brought up again and dealt with in a much bigger way.
I think that just about does it. A reasonably short history of the films Clive Barker has directed and how they led into one another, eventually culminating in the iconic cult classic Hellraiser. It's been a really enjoyable little study, looking at the development of each of these films and finding the common aspects between all of them. It's also quite nice and reassuring for any aspiring filmmakers out there to see this kind of progression. And, knowing that the short films you create in your free time or at film school now can lead to bigger things in the future. I'll end this video with a clip of Clive Barker talking about his view of filmmaking / being a creative person in general. The clip also helps to explain what I was going on about earlier, how it doesn't necessarily matter if your film doesn't have a cohesive narrative, as the purpose of it might be to simply evoke emotion. So hopefully he's put it better than I did, but there you go. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat deep dive into Clive Barker's work, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the shop. Goodbye.
These are by no means sophisticated movies. But when I showed them to people later, they did things to people. And what does an artist want to do? I think an artist wants to do things to other people. It's a sort of form of magic. You want to be able to influence people remotely. And the magician passes a spell along. The magician, works up a potion or puts, needles in dolls. The artist says, I'm going to influence you with words. I'm going to influence you with images. I may never touch you. I may never speak to you. But remotely, I have influenced you. I have power over you. My imagination has power over your mind.